Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Jules, and today is Saturday, the 28th of May 2011. Tonight we have renowned researcher Joseph Farrell. Dr. Farrell has a doctorate from the University of Oxford, and his comprehensive list of books are available in all major bookstores and at his website, gizadeathstar.com. Fitting with this interview, we might preface with a quote, as you do in several of your books, sir. Sir, we're all agreed your theory is crazy. The question that divides us is whether it is crazy enough. We're glad to explore any theory as a team and welcome you to a roundtable discussion with the WebBot Forum. Good evening, Dr. Farrell.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Jules.
The WebBot Forum administrator is Fox, and today he'll be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us tonight. They include moderator Lolly and members Uranus Rising, Patrick, Alton, and Giuseppe. For listeners, this interview will assume you have a fairly good understanding of Dr. Farrell's work, including his many radio interviews on the Byte Radio Show and Coast to Coast AM, along with his many articles on his website. Dr. Farrell also has a new book called Genes, Giants, Monsters and Men, available at all good bookstores and at his website, gizadeathstar.com. This interview will be available on YouTube for free on the WebBot Forum channel or our website, webbotforum.com. Many members will hopefully buy your dinner tonight, Mr. Farrell. So bring your own. So bring your own and share, and by all means, smoke them if you got them. I think tonight you'll notice that you're not the only one that takes the long way around Harvey's barn, but all good. Shall we walk and have a look around the place?
Sure, go ahead.
Great. As a first question, we wanted to know if you were familiar with Cliff High and the WebBots. We heard you speak a little about the WebBot predictions prior to November 2010 and wanted to know what you actually thought of it.
Well, I am vaguely familiar with it. I mean, I haven't followed it closely, but as far as I understand it, it's tracking the occurrence of certain words or phrases, which to my mind is kind of a component of social engineering, of social psycholinguistics, and that's a fairly established academic field. So I'm willing to give it a little bit of credit or a little bit of credence as far as a measure of what people are thinking. And to me that's important because in social engineering, in the attempt to manage perceptions and to engineer people's perceptions, to a certain extent people themselves engineer their own reality. They create their own templates, their own filters by which they interpret things, and that to me would seem to be a useful tool for understanding what's out there in terms of the matrix, so to speak.
Fantastic. And we've broken up our topics, our questions into different topics, and it's a good segue, I guess. Your answer is that the first topic is the Philosopher's Stone, the magic of social engineering. Lolly, can you ask a question?
Hi, Dr. Farrell. It's such a pleasure to speak with you tonight.
Hi, Lolly.
Hi. So as members of the WebBot Forum, one of the functions we're engaged in is to look for temporal markers and bot hits, news items and events that may indicate the fulfillment of these linguistics, either an actual event or just the language. The data Cliff collects is heavily weighted to negative emotional descriptors, and thus we're often reading and discussing negative events, just plain old bad news.
Right.
While this activity may contribute to the veracity of Cliff's reports, it can be difficult to stay out of the doom and gloom perspective. As truth seekers, how do we contribute to an understanding of world events while at the same time avoid creating these negative events? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I do. I'm one of those, Lolly, that has been very concerned with a phenomenon that I've called at some occasions apocalypse mongering, and on other occasions I've called it apocalypse theater. A friend of mine and I are a co-author on a book that's just now coming out, as a matter of fact, called Grid of the Gods. We've been noticing this phenomenon. And I've spoken several times to this very point on the Byte Show. And one of the things I advise people to do is, if they're the praying sort, to pray for good things, and if they're not the praying sort, at least to think, to think
right.
good things. Because in my view, the physical medium has a direct interface that's not very well understood. It's being written about by modern physicists and by people that study consciousness as well, that there's some sort of interface between the physical medium and human consciousness that's very direct. And in my own studies of this phenomenon, and I think you could get this to a certain extent even from quantum mechanics, is that there's some sort of group multiplier effect. And so it concerns me that we have such a widespread, almost culturally pervasive outlook now that is very apocalyptic, very negative, and rationalizes everything that it sees, interprets everything that it sees according to some sort of apocalyptic scenario, whether it be that of the fundamentalist Christians or that of the 2012 prophet gloom and doom predictors and so on and so forth. I think there's a kind of cultural pervasiveness of this apocalypse mongering. And I'm not convinced that we are, in spite of all the bad news in the world, I'm not convinced that we are faced with an apocalypse unless it's one of our own making. And this is why I advise people, it's okay to follow these things. It's okay to watch them, to try and interpret them. But at the same time, I generally urge people, and I try and do this in my own life, and that is to pray for good things, to pray or think, if you're not the praying sort, to think of good things, to do good things, to bring goodness and beauty in the world to the extent that's possible in your own life. And I really do think that if there is a group multiplier effect, that if enough people start doing this, things might turn around. That's it's
right.
kind of a grand social engineering experiment in reverse. So
Right.
that's kind of my take on things.
So it sounds like, truth-seeking is fine and looking for these bot hits and trying to understand things, but to have some balance in the whole endeavor. Because we have 1,000 members on our forum, I think, close to 1,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I think so. And if the same sort of creativity can be exercised to find good things and to report them and to enact them in one's own life and more importantly to enact them as a group. I said something on the Byte show that in response to a listener who had commented that, I'm some sort of Illuminatus simply because I attended the University of Oxford. Not only have they fallen on hard times, but, to recruit someone like me. But I also responded to some of these comments, that I really have only one motivation in my life, and that is to love and to be loved. And as part of that component, I think, yes, one seeks for and tries to find truth and share it as well as one can. But I do think that there has to be activity connected with that, and that activity, I think, has to be in the conscious and deliberate selection and choice of goodness and of beauty and of love, to invoke those Platonic ideals. So, I think that we are faced with social engineering on a massive scale, and if we're going to fight it, we literally have to fight it, and the way to fight it is precisely to do this sort of thing.
Right. So the multiplier effect that you talked about, as we're looking at and engaged in this truth-seeking and looking at the events and seeing, connecting dots and seeing where things might fit. How does the multiplier effect work with that? Is that a negative thing to actually be doing then?
No, I don't think so. I do think that the laws of this multiplier effect are probably being studied very carefully in various covert programs. No one knows exactly how it works. But to give a case in point, shortly before and after 9/11, as most of your forum members are probably aware, there was a spike in the Princeton experiments on their consciousness experiments. And I think that's some sort of indicator of this multiplier effect. And there have been similar experiments where people have prayed or concentrated, for certain things to happen, and they have. And I think we're in the position where we have to be kind of careful about doing this sort of thing, and that's why in my advice to people on praying or thinking for good things, I don't get much more specific than that, because if you're thinking good, if your intention is good, if your willful deliberation is focused on good things, on peaceful things, on compassion, and so on and so forth, I think that's as far as we need take it. The specifics of it, that gets into a realm of actual experimental science, and that's always kind of dubious and dodgy in something like this. So I kind of play my cards close to the chest there, simply because I think it's necessary for some sort of caution. This is very powerful stuff. In a certain sense, it's a kind of high magic, and one has to be very, very careful. But by the same token, we're not defenseless, and that's the other point I'm trying to make with this idea of a direct interface between consciousness and the medium. We're not defenseless, we're not powerless, and we can use our minds and our will for good things.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense? I hope I'm answering your question.
It does, but it does. It does. So along the lines of the social engineering, what do you think? Do you think that they're trying to engineer a certain type of human?
Oh boy, that is a $64 trillion question. I'm doing a book right now with a friend of mine that we're getting into this question in a certain very deliberate way. But the short answer, are they trying to engineer a new kind of human? The short answer to that, I think, has to be yes. And the reason why is simply my past few books have been dealing with the subject of alchemy in one form or another. And one of the goals of esoteric alchemy was precisely the transformation of the human consciousness. And I think to a certain extent we've been looking at grand experiments in that respect in the last century with communism, with National Socialism, and so on and so forth. We've been looking at experiments to transform the human consciousness, to transform human culture. I think it's still ongoing, and I think it's part of a much larger agenda, but yes, the short answer would be yes.
So what do you think the purpose is when you say a much larger agenda?
I'd rather not get into that now, because that's the subject of a book that I'm writing, and I don't like discussing what I'm writing until it's actually in the hands of the printer. It's become something of a discretion is the better part of valor sort of thing.
Sure.
With me, I learned my lesson the hard way a few years back by discussing books that I was writing before they were actually at the printer. So now I just keep my mouth shut.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks. So again, along the lines of social engineering, so I understand the magic of social engineering uses principles of alchemy to achieve a certain effect: fear, passivity, and people who don't think for themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, they've done a pretty good job with this project, in many ways creating a seamless web of distractions.
Yes.
What would you imagine the condition of humanity to be if these principles were applied with the intention of aiding the development of humanity for the greater good?
Well, I can't really see, quite frankly, I can't see any, the people that may be doing this may have good intentions, but I do not see how creating a race of docile, brain-dead, consciousness-numbed people is in fact serving the greater good of humanity. And that's what makes me suspicious of the whole agenda. I think the last thing that the powers that be would want is a humanity that is fully awakened, fully conscious, fully compassionate, fully intended upon good, fully able to think for itself and think critically. Because we would have, if that were the case, we would have an explosion. We would have a new renaissance, and it would be much more difficult for the powers that be to control a population like that. So I'd have to dispute the idea that if this is going on, it's being done for altruistic agendas or altruistic aims. I think quite the reverse. I think that the goal may be sinister. I don't know what exactly that goal may be, but I do think that it's sinister. I don't see the benefit to humanity of having a bunch of brain-dead couch potatoes. I really don't.
No, there's no benefit. I was asking about your, what life could be like, and and do you think we're moving towards that in this awakening?
Well, be more specific. Moving towards a new enlightenment.
Yes.
Well, I think that's a fair question, and it's a good one. I think that we're moving towards something. I think, to a certain extent, I think some of Mr. Hoagland's ideas, while I dispute some of the details of how he gets to where he gets to this point, but I do think that the point that he gets to, where the good are becoming better and the bad are becoming worse, I do think to a certain extent that's true. I see humanity right now dividing into two major camps. A very small one that has begun to think for itself, to think critically, to broaden the horizons of tolerance and compassion, and on the other, a broad segment of humanity that is interested in the increase of its own power and hegemony over other human beings. Also allied with that, you have the mass part of humanity wanting their toys, their security, their easy, comfortable life, and don't want to get too much out of that box. I think we're dividing along those lines rather sharply right now. I do think ultimately that good will win, but it's not going to happen by dint of some messianic occurrence, be it the return of the Imam Mahdi or E.T. coming out of the blue to rescue us from our follies. I don't think it's going to happen that way. I think it has to happen from within the human heart and mind itself. And that's why I go back and try to urge people to do good, think good, and if they're the praying sort, pray for good. I'm a praying sort, but there are others who aren't. And I don't think that in these times, I don't think that it behooves anyone to start boxing people up into theistic or atheistic boxes and saying that one or the other is bad and evil by dint of their metaphysical belief. So, I try and urge people to some sort of metaphysical action on the part of their will, on the part of their mind, to do good.
I would agree with your observation that separation or gap is becoming quite visible.
Oh, yes.
To those who are, awake and aware. Just moving now into some more social uprising and covert agendas. Uh-huh. In one of your last interviews on the Bite Show, you speculated that some of the current events that we're seeing, for example, the uprisings in Egypt, may be due in part to technology being reactivated. Can you say more about that?
Well, as you know, I've long speculated that the ancients had a much higher technology than we give them credit for. I began writing on these topics, of course, with the Giza Death Star books, in which I tried to outline my belief, my idea, my hypothesis that at least some of these pyramidal structures, particularly at Giza, were high technology devices designed quite literally to manipulate or to engineer the physical medium very directly. Well, if we take that idea and couple it with what I just said previously in this interview, that there is some sort of direct interface between the physical medium and consciousness itself, then it may be possible, and again, simply as a raw speculation and nothing more, it may be possible that due to certain alignments in local celestial space and so on and so forth, that some of these devices are being reactivated in ways that we don't fully understand and perhaps are affecting consciousness. The other thing that we need to remember in this respect is that the technologies that we see the various great powers of the world actually building, I think in particular of HARP-like technologies. We've got versions of HARP in Russia, we've got versions in Europe, there's versions being run by Japan, and so on and so forth. Well, these technologies can be entrained to the natural Schumann resonance of the Earth. They can be entrained to the natural frequencies of the brain. I wrote a section in Babylon's Banksters about how certain ancient temples on engineering principles look to be entrained to frequencies of the brain to induce certain kinds of emotional states. So the technologies exist. So what I have to wonder is, with this sudden, apparently spontaneous, and part of me suspects that it's not entirely spontaneous, that these uprisings in the Middle East may be the result of the application of some technology in conjunction with some covert action or psychological operations on the part of some hidden player or players. I think all of this may be the case and may be in play here. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. So you would imagine then the purpose of this reactivation would be to fulfill some of their sinister agendas.
It could very well possibly be that, yes. Yeah. Okay. I'm very skeptical for the reason, Lolly, that we see uprisings in areas of the Middle East where, for one thing, in my own research, we saw the heavy post-war presence of Nazis involved in forging alliances with radical Islam, with forging alliances with nascent political and revolutionary groups in these places. And I've long maintained that this post-war Nazi organization is probably still in existence in some degree or fashion to this day. So that makes me skeptical on that basis. And in fact, just today, I haven't even had time to read this email, but someone sent me a news clipping that the revolutionaries, or some of the revolutionaries in Egypt, are looking to form some sort of kind of neo-Nazi party. So, yeah, it's, and I'm not saying that it's all being driven by those people. There are certainly people involved with these uprisings that do want a kind of democratic reform of the governments that they've been living under, and you can't blame them. So I think we're dealing here with a mix of things. I think we're dealing with a spontaneous outbreak. I think it's legitimate in a great degree, and like all such revolutions, there are certain people trying to steer them to certain ends.
Right. So, in some way, manipulating the energy of what might be a purposefully, an uprising that we might say, well, good for them, but then using that energy to directing it towards their purposes.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
absolutely.
Got it. Okay, thanks so much, Joseph. I'll talk to you later in the interview.
All right, thank you, Lal. I hope I answered your questions.
You did, thanks.
Alton, do you have a question for Dr. Farrell?
I have a question from Andromeda here. All right, Dr. Farrell, a question that I have is related to whether you are aware of a civilization called Farrell in Peru. The reason I mention this is because it strikes me that this civilization did not follow the warrior trend of the others and might have been able to maintain the God of Corn principle, meaning that the peaceful coexistence and cooperation were manifested in this 5,000-year-old city, which may suggest that even if the genetic cousin comes and claims he owns the human race because it is genetically engineered, maybe, there are other strands and civilizations that were contemporary or older that represented an existing humankind, and that those genetically engineered are not all of the inhabitants of this planet. Klaus Dona, for example, mentions that humans are much older than what we have been told, as there are artifacts discovered in South America that contradict the official histories that we've all learned in schools. My intuition and worry is that things are converging between the WebBot and what you are publishing in your new books. It may be possible that a staged alien invasion with the technology of the Nazis, also known as the perfected Nazi Bell, may be on the making, and that they will claim somehow that they own humanity. So, what do you think we can do to avoid this direct enslavement that is brewing and ready to pop up? And whether you think that one of the factions of the black government is a Nazi faction alive and well in Argentina?
Oh boy, lots of questions there. First off, I'm not familiar with the civilization that he's talking about, so I can't really address that directly, but I can speak to the issue of the antiquity of the human race and to the idea that the genetic engineering, or purported genetic engineering, let's be more precise, of humanity would form a basis in law to stake a claim that humanity is property. Let us assume that, for the sake of argument, that somebody comes to Earth or claims to be returning to Earth and asserts its right to humanity as its property. In order for that to work, they would have to prove conclusively and do so in terms that modern human science could accept that their claim was valid, number one. And then number two, you'd have the thorny problem in law, which is if you abandon property for a long enough period of time and someone else moves in and takes care of that property, pays the taxes on it and so on, well, they essentially lose their stake on that property. It becomes someone else's property. And I think you could argue that in humanity's case that has happened. We've certainly, at least to all intents and purposes, appear to have taken care of our own affairs for the last several thousand millennia, or for the last several thousand years, I should say. So they would have to afford convincing scientific proof, and that raises another problem. Would that proof ever be made publicly available? Would it be certain enough that it would be perceived as such by ordinary man? And I'm very doubtful about all of that. So I think you have to weigh things in that respect. I don't know enough about that civilization that he's mentioning to comment on whether or not they maintained a kind of a corn god approach to things vis-a-vis the other cultures and societies around them. So I can't comment to that. As for the idea of an existing Nazi international based in Argentina, I think you would have to look at that in a twofold way. The first would be, to my mind and the research that I've conducted thus far, I think that Argentina has long since ceased to function as more or less the headquarters for this group, wherever it may be. I think by now that it has, if it's still in existence, and I do believe personally that it is, I think by now it has managed to infiltrate itself into so many areas of human endeavor, into so many corporations, into so many bureaucracies, that it's probably rather pointless to look for a particular place as constituting its headquarters. If I were to locate a headquarters for it, I think I would probably locate it somewhere in Europe. There are indications in other people's research that it might have actually migrated or gone to Taiwan, of all places. But I do think, on the other hand, that this post-war fascist international, whatever you want to call it, definitely did exist. It was well-financed. It was well-organized. And I don't see, as yet, much evidence to suggest that it ever went out of existence. I think, quite the contrary, that there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that in the 1970s restructuring of the underground drug trade, that it played a major role in doing that. So I think the organization probably still does exist. As to where its headquarters are, again, that's anybody's guess. But I don't think Argentina.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alton. Well, next we'll go into the section or topic of UFOs and ETs and the Breakaway civilization. Giuseppe, you have a question?
Yes, hi, Dr. Farrell. I know you have researched extensively the Nazi Bell Project, probably more than most other people. One possible example of the fruits of their labor, as far as the project is concerned, I think, is Admiral Byrd's Operation High Jump, which led a flotilla of ships with over 4,000 troops after World War II. The expedition was to attack and rid what was left of the Nazi bases in Antarctica. As we know, they were largely defeated, but pulled back, licking their wounds. Many involved mentioned flying vehicles they could barely describe defending their bases. My imagination simply can go wild speculating how far their technology must have advanced by now. Can you give us an idea, or would you know how far their advancement has come with the Bell Project?
Well, let me back you up. I'm afraid I have to disagree a bit with the reading that you're giving the Operation High Jump, and this is very, very difficult. This operation has been used by many to maintain that the Nazis had established some sort of secret base, and usually that is accompanied by the assumption that it was some sort of secret research base. The problem here is that the verifiable information coming out of Operation High Jump, and I'm stressing the word verifiable, not the stuff that you pick up on the internet with Admiral Byrd's alleged declassified diaries and so on and so forth, but the actual verifiable stuff that appeared in El Mercurio newspaper out of Santiago. All that Admiral Byrd ever said, and it's the only quotation that I can verify, all he ever said was that the United States must prepare itself to defend itself against enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed, and that's all he said. So the assumption has been on the part of post-war Nazi researchers that Operation High Jump encountered some sort of Nazi base, that they were using all their fantastic flying saucer technology, which they were researching there, and I have to disagree with that assumption on one very, very significant point. The only technology that we have a verifiable story that gives us enough details, and this is the crucial point, that gives us enough details that we can reconstruct a putative physics for it, is the Nazi Bell story. All the other stories about Nazi Hanabu and Vril and all of this happy nonsense that you have coming out of the post-war period is coming out of precisely a neo-Nazi circle based in southern West Germany and Austria after the war. The documents that they purport to produce give you no clue as to where these things were being built. There's no provenance for the documents. There's no putative science that is talked about in these documents. You simply have a bunch of drawings of what look to be flying saucers, and that's about it. So I've tended on the basis of the fact that you cannot take these documents and reconstruct any sort of evidentiary paper trail, that you cannot reconstruct a putative scientific reasoning behind them, and that you have these documents coming out of post-war neo-Nazi circles. I've always looked at these documents with a great deal of skepticism. So that leaves us with the Bell and with these post-war Antarctica stories. The problem there is the problem with the Bell story is the Bell, we have a case of a technology that we can reconstruct a putative engineering and scientific rationalization for. Now, if you've looked at my research, the research of Igor Vitkovsky and Nick Cook, we're all agreed that the Bell required an enormous amount of electrical power in order to operate, to such an extent that the Nazis apparently built an entire electrical power plant near the facilities, within hundreds of yards, as a matter of fact, of the facilities where the Bell was being tested. If they were doing this kind of research, therefore, in Antarctica, they would have had to have access to similar amounts of electrical power. And that, to me, is what is really the problem with these post-war Antarctica Nazi survival stories. I think it's ludicrous on that basis to assume that they had a research base there and that they were producing all of the extraordinary technologies in Antarctica. I think that it's far more likely that these technologies, if they were being produced anywhere, were being produced in Latin America, most likely at that time in Juan Perón's Argentina. If there was any sort of Nazi base in Antarctica, I think probably the best we could assume for it, under the circumstances under which the Germans were operating during the final years of World War II, was that it was at best a covert U-boat operations base. There may have been a small military resupply base and so on. So I question to this day the reading that Operation High Jump was to take out a secret Nazi research base, although I am open to the idea that we may have encountered some sort of advanced technology there that we were simply unprepared to deal with. That I have no problem with. My big problem is reading that the origin of this technology is coming from Argentina. If we're looking at Nazis, I don't think it's coming from Argentina. And I realize my answer is very complicated, but you have to be very, very careful with these post-war Nazi stories because a lot of them are coming from neo-Nazis themselves, and you have to weigh what they're saying with other evidence. Otherwise, you've not got any corroboration. So I hope my answer makes some sort of sense.
No, thank you for clarifying the answer, actually.
Thanks, Dr. Farrell. Interestingly, you said that, especially in your latest blog, I think it was on the 26th of May, where you talked about, you quoted this crazy Russian politician talking about
Vladimir Zhirinovsky, yeah.
Yeah, that can put whole continents to sleep. I mean, talking about Giuseppe's question about advanced technology, if they have that type of technology, it's pretty scary, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I forgot to answer that part of his question. You know, he asked where this technology would be today. Would they have been able to perfect it? Well, you know, I get asked that question a lot, Jules, and my answer is always the same. If we look at where the story of the Bell says that the Nazis were at the end of World War II, in other words, they had a device that actually apparently levitated on the base of some sort of field properties that it was giving off. It gave off deadly effects. It wasn't a practically flyable device, so to speak. And Nazis being Nazis, they're interested in it, obviously, ultimately for a weapon. But if you take the story as it stands and then extrapolate from that, 60 plus years since the end of World War II, well, the old statement, with enough money and manpower, where would they be today? And my feeling is, my intuition is that they would probably be very far indeed. And I've even addressed on my website in the members only area in a white paper some very strange statements of American engineers involved in American black projects that are needless to say, very suggestive as to how far they might have taken some of this technology. So, I think it's possible they've taken it very far.
Thank you. And just all you need to do is just get some third generation night vision goggles. But we're going to later. Uranus, you got a question for Dr. Farrell?
Yes. Hello. I want to start off by just saying I think that by revealing facts and evidence, what is really going on is a real counterbalance to all the social engineering going on. And I hope we can do so also in our own small way. And I want to thank you personally.
Well, thank you, Uranus. I appreciate that.
Now to my question. In your work, you've set out to inquire and research into human technological capabilities, notably Nazi technology.
Right.
And have revealed some compelling results, that there is exotic and off-the-books human and terrestrial technology that far exceeds what the public is told. To my mind, you have rightly separated UFOs and ETs, as they have somehow become associated together, which does not help with the investigation of either.
Right.
And recently, in one of the members' videos on your website, you posed a question about UFOs. Is the physics sufficient to compel to the idea that UFOs be extraterrestrial? And you answered it, in most cases, it is no. Right. Could you address these issues taking into consideration such areas as social engineering, possible government or black ops agendas, and the potential technologies that could account for terrestrial UFOs? And finally, what research and kinds of discernment would you like to see take place in the area of ufology?
Well, I'm writing a book right now where I'm getting into the relationship of social engineering and some of these technologies, because this, again, is a story that is very fascinating, and it's not, in my opinion, Uranus, it's not very well understood. I don't think that there's been sufficient attention brought to it. And that said, let me say one more thing. I am not, and never have been, philosophically opposed to the existence of ETs, nor even to the idea that some UFOs might represent some sort of extraterrestrial technology, or conversely some sort of interdimensional technology. You know, I'm not opposed to those ideas at all. I think anyone who's read the research of Dr. Jacques Vallée would have to conclude, coming away from it, that there is a case to be made for these things being interpreted in that way. My problem has always been with the dogmatic assumption within ufology that these things always must be extraterrestrial. And in most cases, as you've pointed out, I don't see a physics signature that's sufficient to do that. Let me give you some examples. If you go back to the period of, let's say, from about the time of Roswell up to about 1955 to 1956, and look at the cases of UFO sightings reported simply in the American press. We're leaving out of view here the Canadian, the European, the Australian, the Orient, and so on and so forth. In most of those cases, the top speeds recorded for these craft were said to be around 1,200 miles per hour. All right, and this figure, to me, is very puzzling, because it recurs in the literature of that time over and over and over and over, that figure of 1,200 miles per hour. And in fact, I even wrote about that at some length in my book Roswell and the Reich. Well, the problem with this figure is number one, it's obviously insufficient for any sort of interplanetary technology, much less an interstellar technology. So in other words, the physics there isn't compelling to the idea that these things are extraterrestrial at all. They're just simply very, very advanced craft of some sort that far exceed the normal speed limitations of publicly known human technology of the day. And again, I try and trace some of the Nazi technology that made claim for similar speeds, the work of Dr. Walter Lippisch, who eventually ended up at Wright-Patterson in Dayton, Ohio. So, we've got clear indicators in the literature from that period that while the technology is advanced, while it's exotic, it's not exotic enough to be practical as an interplanetary technology, much less an interstellar one. So when we look at planetary geology of our nearest planetary neighbors at that time, the thinking is, or was anyway, that those planets weren't sufficient to support a large base of intelligent life. So, by the principle of parsimony, we're kind of left with Earth as being the home base for these things. The question is, who's producing them? So that's my argument on the basis of the physics. The only way that ufology has traditionally responded to arguments like that has been to assume a kind of argument from silence, that, these may not be the top performance figures for these craft, and, if they're capable of this, they may have been capable of much more, and so on and so forth. But again, that's an argument from silence, and I think we have to kind of stick to the known facts in these cases and argue from there. So, in answer to the other part of your question as to what I think ufology should be doing, is I think number one, ufology has to shed itself of its religious components. It's taken on all the trappings of a secular religion. Disclosures replaced revelation, and extraterrestrials and their intentions have replaced, sky gods or what have you. But for all intents and purposes, it has much of the trappings of a religion. I think if it's going to flourish as a field of investigation, we need, number one, a new crop of UFO researchers. I think the old standard names in ufology have done it a disservice by promoting the extraterrestrial agenda so completely without looking very critically at their own assumptions and conclusions. So that, I hope that answers your question, or rather your questions, because they're all good ones, and we could talk all night just on those questions.
I know it would be easy to do so, and I've appreciated your papers on Richard Dolan's work and adding your perspective on that. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
This next question actually comes from Fox, and he says, personally, I would like to know your thoughts on a few subjects in particular. One of which is what you might think about Werner Van Braun's last known interview with Carol Rosin in 1974, in which it is said by her that he said, in order to maintain the military-industrial complex, the Russians were going to be the enemy, followed by the terrorists, then the asteroids,
yes,
and finally, and the final scare would be by extraterrestrials. It is the third enemy that space-based weapons would be built for. So far, first two have come to pass, and it seems that asteroids are becoming more prominent. Obviously, he knew of their plans back then.
Right.
So what do you think of this?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I refer in several of my books, as a matter of fact, to the Rosen affidavit. I refer to it in Roswell and the Reich. I've referred to it in the Nazi International, in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and in Reich of the Black Sun. In fact, the only book I've written about the Nazis that I didn't refer to that affidavit, I think, was Secrets of the Unified Field. And I'm incidentally referring to it yet again in the book I'm writing now. So, take that for whatever it's worth as a little clue into one of the things I'm writing now. But
good.
The question raises, I think, and I think what Fox is getting at here is there seems to have been an inside knowledge on at least the part of von Braun that there was some coupling of the idea of this advanced technology and the whole extraterrestrial hypothesis. In other words, the suggestion is being made that this was some sort of deliberate, long-term psychological operation agenda, all right? Now, without giving away details, I tend to that view. And I tend to it for a number of reasons. I think Richard Dolan is laying out in his works and more recently his interviews, I think he's laying out a very, very good and very profound case that his idea of a breakaway civilization is in fact true. My quibble with Mr. Dolan would be very minor, in that I think we're dealing with more than one such civilization, all right? And number two, I think in both cases they have made it part of their, so to speak, their operating principle that the technologies that they have their hands on are best used in a social engineering fashion. In other words, they have conceived of this technology as a way to re-engineer or restructure human consciousness and culture itself. And to me, that's the scary part of the agenda. You know, if that be so, then what do they want to do? How do they want to restructure human culture and agenda? Well, the disturbing fact is that this is a statement being made, let's face it, by a Nazi. Okay? And I don't think anyone here in this forum would look to the Third Reich as a model for the future for humanity and moral progress. You know? So I look at it. I look at it with a very jaundiced eye. Let's put it that way.
Well, good. What about disclosure?
What can you be more specific?
Do you think there's going to be disclosure soon, or do you think that that's just another agenda as well?
I think it's another agenda. Disclosure to me, Uranus, is very, I go back to my reading of much of contemporary ufology as a religion, all right? And I get into that aspect of things quite a bit in the new book I'm writing as to why that's so, and one of the things that has been present in ufology almost since the beginning is this notion of disclosure. And to me, it's kind of like, the fundamentalist evangelicals that come out every few years or so with a date when the rapture is supposed to occur. Well, number one, the rapture isn't any part of early Christian doctrine to begin with. It is in itself a bit of created false expectation. In other words, it's a socially engineered phenomenon. So I look at all the disclosure talk from the standpoint that, this disclosure talk has been going on since the 1950s, and it never seems to get anywhere. But it fulfills, from another point of view, if you look at it as a bit of psychological operation, it fulfills from another point of view an interesting social engineering agenda, because it keeps people distracted, I think, from certain obvious things and looking in places that really aren't too helpful. And one of the things I think it definitely keeps people distracted from is looking at the whole issue of this technology as being terrestrial in nature, and looking for possible scientific rationalizations for how it arose in the actual literature. And I think in that case, it's been a very, very effective tactic on the part of whoever was behind it. So I'm very skeptical of the whole notion of disclosure. I just don't see. Let's look at it this way. If we are assuming, for the sake of argument, that a lot of this technology is terrestrial in nature, then it is a black technology by definition. It's a product of black projects. So in that case, if that be so, I don't see the powers that control that technology as wanting to disclose the fact that it's terrestrial. Because once that idea gets into the popular consciousness, then people are going to start doing exactly what I and others have tried to do, and show that there is a rational scientific basis that you can reconstruct certain dots and connect certain dots in the public literature, beginning back between the period between the world wars and continuing forward to the present. I think they want to keep that out of view, because the other thing we have to remember is that technology then implies two further things. It implies, on the good side, on the positive side, it implies a potential end to our dependence on non-renewable energy resources, number one. And that means an end to the financial monopoly that has basically been the most influential in the West for the last 200 years. So that's the first thing that it implies. But the second thing, and I've said this over and over again, that it implies is a negative thing, a very negative thing. And that is, if you have this kind of technology with the ability to manipulate and engineer the physical medium directly, then if you weaponize that technology, if you apply it to that application, you have a potential weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So from the standpoint of the elite, they know this. They know that it would be their worst proliferation nightmare. Forget about Iran having the atomic bomb. It's worse than if Iran would have the hydrogen bomb, because this would be much easier to engineer. It gives you the ability to apply that technology in a weapons platform to manipulate earthquakes, to manipulate weather, and so on and so forth. And once you have that, then you have the ultimate in plausible deniability, because, Mother Nature affords you wonderful plausible deniability if you have a technology that can literally level cities by means of tornadoes or earthquakes and what have you. So this is the other thing I think that the elite is concerned about. They have to keep this technology out of the public view until they can figure out some way to let it out into the open without it being proliferated in a weapons platform. Because if we're concerned about Iran now, then if this stuff gets out, we could be concerned about Bangladesh holding the world hostage. Basically, it's much easier to engineer. It's much cheaper. It's a multi-shot technology. In other words, unlike a hydrogen bomb, when you light one of those off, you've used up your bomb. Well, you can fire this thing over and over and over. So it's a proliferation nightmare for the global power elites, and until they figure out a way to control the proliferation aspects of it, they're not going to release it. So they have to have a psychological operation to divert people's attention away from the development of this technology. And again, I think this is a convenient way to do it. Let's look to ET and make this technology so exotic and so advanced that, it's far beyond human capability, and therefore humans won't look for it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Now I've got another question for you.
Uh-huh.
You recently wrote an excellent analysis of a breakaway civilization, including thoughts on a secret space program that is perhaps indicative of a breakaway civilization, or as you just mentioned, civilizations plural. And that the Japanese bearer bond scandal may have had something to do with the funding mechanisms for such. Could you just give us a synopsis of this, including who you consider might possibly be involved in such a civilization?
Well, if we're going to have a breakaway civilization, I think you're referring to the paper I wrote for the members-only area on my website. And as I say, I'm writing more papers on this idea, and hopefully we'll be posting them shortly, and also writing them. Go ahead.
I hope you realize I'm trying to plug your members only section.
Yes, I do, and I appreciate that.
Good.
I'm writing another book, as I said, that's going to be dealing with this whole idea of a breakaway civilization and secret space programs and so on and so forth. But the bottom line for me, Uranus, is if Mr. Dolan's hypothesis of a breakaway civilization is true, and I think it is, I think he's on to something there in a major way, and I think he's argued the case fairly well in his more recent interviews. The problem with the breakaway civilization is largely one of funding. In other words, if we're going to be conducting the research to create the technologies that would make a civilization like that possible, then it's going to require a huge capital outlay, not only in terms of the finance of it, but also in terms of the human capital involved. In other words, the research technicians themselves. Now, in the case of the Nazi International, which I would definitely argue is precisely one of these breakaway civilizations, because if we look at the Third Reich in a certain way, the Nazi Party is midwifed into existence by certain secret societies inside of the Weimar Republic between the wars. The Nazi Party eventually takes power, of course, in Germany, and begins a crash program within the SS, which constitutes itself as a breakaway bureaucracy within the Nazi Party structure. So you have a breakaway civilization giving birth to yet another breakaway civilization. And the SS, if you've read Albert Speer's memoirs very carefully, he notes that the SS created quite literally a whole off-the-books parallel economy. And this in turn is what I think survives World War II in the Nazi International, because my word, the Nazis made it out of Europe with a tremendous body of plunder and booty and loot from Europe, not only in terms of liquid cash, but in terms of other convertible instrumentalities like patents. They made it out of Europe with a number of technicians and scientists, which they managed to disperse all over the world and get them into various host countries to continue their research. So they had an inbuilt financial structure in place after World War II. All right. In the case of the American breakaway civilization, I think you've got two things going on. You've got, number one, a response to this Nazi International, and number two, it has to create a funding mechanism that remains outside of public scrutiny. Now, we know the standard techniques by which they've done this, the black budget, the overinflated prices on toilet seats and hammers, and so on and so forth, but this still isn't going to give it a finance base large enough to conduct what I think its enormous costs would be. And the reason I think the costs are enormous is just look at the price of one B-1 stealth bomber. And that's a publicly known technology. So in other words, the costs of whatever technologies exist off the books that are unknown to us have got to be astronomical. So they've got to have astronomical figures for money. So enter the Japanese bearer bonds scandal. Why I think that might be connected, and again, there's no direct evidence that it is. It's just that the circumstances of the whole thing are just downright peculiar any way you slice it. For one thing, you had billion-dollar bearer bonds in denominations of $1 billion being counterfeited, which in itself is a suspicious activity because, number one, no such denomination ever existed in American securities. So either this was a complete farce and a joke, and a very bad one, because, you know, anyone buying those things is going to attempt to verify their veracity. So it's either a very bad joke or it's a counterfeit of an instrumentality that actually existed. And if that's the case, then whoever's doing the counterfeiting of these billion-dollar bonds is sending, I think, a deliberate message. We know that something is up. And the reason I'm connecting it to space is that the Japanese, of course, had their moon probe, and they've been releasing slowly but surely their pictures of things on the moon. And they're a little peculiar, you know. There's no way of getting around it. So, you know, I think if we're going to have a funding mechanism for an American breakaway civilization, it's going to be in the fashion of a parallel financial structure, a parallel financial debt structure. And it's going to consist of precisely securities that are not well known, that are off the books. It's going to consist also most likely of considerable amount of money laundering, money from the drug trade, money laundering through things like huge, large-scale ministries that, you know, put the cloak of God over the money and then launder the money that way. It's going to be laundered through all the standard techniques, in other words, that intelligence agencies use to do this sort of thing. So the Japanese thing, the bearer bond thing, just raised my suspicion meters immensely, because the whole episode, Uranus, was so peculiar. These Japanese men acted like they wanted to be caught.
Yes, message.
Yes, and again, that's to send a message, as you say, and that I think was what was going on. We know that there's a parallel financial structure that exists off the books, and, you know, we know it because we've counterfeited the instrumentalities to it.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you very much for that. That's great.
Yeah,
Thank you, Uranus. Thank you. And it doesn't help the Pentagon misplacing $4 trillion in accounting trickery.
No.
Joseph, what we'll do is we'll just have a quick 3-minute break and then we'll be back. Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay, we're back with Joseph Farrell. His website is gizadeathstar.com. Okay, Dr. Farrell, following on from Alton, Andromeda, and Uranus's questions, something seems to be happening if you look up using third-generation night vision goggles. How close are we to a full-scale war? We haven't had the Carol Rosen asteroid scare yet, but Cliff's Webbot sees the alien meme having a short-term peak in October of 2011. How close do you think we are to this event? Do you think it will be a Project Bluebeam, fake alien invasion scenario, or a true war, possibly a new cosmic war, as written in the Vedic texts and with myths like the return of Quetzalcoatl?
Well, as for false fulfillment scenarios, I don't want to speak to that right now. It's an area I've been investigating with a friend. I fully intend to write about it. It's very, very different, in my opinion, than what most people suspect. That said, do I think that we're witnessing a full-scale war going on upstairs? Well, the short answer to that, in my opinion, is yes, we are. As to who it's a war between, that's a good question. If we go back to my hypothesis of a Nazi international that continued researching all of these black projects after the war, and if we further assume that they brought those projects to some sort of state of development where they were practical as an interplanetary technology, then we could be looking at a war between, quite literally, one faction of humanity and another. And I think that that there's a certain amount of evidence that might be the case. Is there another factor that might have interjected itself into that war in recent months or years? That's also possible too. There are people arguing that. The problem that I have with that hypothesis has been that there is no hard and fast evidence that that's the case, other than statements of anonymous sources and whistleblowers and, intelligence contacts and so on and so forth. I think if we're going to argue that, we have the best approach to do it would be to make some sort of inductive case, and that's very difficult to make, even in terms of the assumption that we're dealing with human factions on Earth fighting it out up there. So, short answer is yes, I think that we are witnessing a war. The hard question is between who and why, and I really have no answers to that other than raw speculation.
Thanks, Joseph. Giuseppe, you've got some questions?
Yes, Dr. Farrell, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a question from, this is coming from Andromeda. Her question goes this way. A question that I have is related to your interview in the Byte Show regarding churches and the religion that are based on the God of death.
Yes.
Okay. I do believe that churches were built over energetic point lines, and I'm fascinated that he mentions in the Byte Show interview about Genesis, giants, monsters, and men, and that ancient temples promote alpha brain waves on people, which of course makes people susceptible to implantation of ideas or hypnotism.
Yes.
Could it be possible that the pyramid and other similar monuments are all part of the same network? And if you don't mind me asking the next one also, and could it be possible that the intention of such network might or may be to harness the minds of people so we are kept in a state of virtual lobotomy? Hence, only few do something about the atrocities that are being orchestrated every day on this planet.
Well, is it possible for these things to be in a network where they would be influencing consciousness or emotional states? Well, sure, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things I was trying to get at when I wrote that chapter in Genius, Giants, Monsters, and Men. As to the first part of the question, are churches and so on built over certain nodal points? I talk about that very, very briefly at the end of a book that just came out called Grid of the Gods. It's the first book I've actually co-authored. A friend of mine from Oxford days by the name of Scott DeHart helped me write portions of this book. And at the end of that book, we talk very specifically about this particular fact that many churches in Europe are built on such sites. But more importantly, what really interests us is we talk about the symbolism in some of these churches that very few people fully recognize for what they are. And to put it in a nutshell, the symbolism is not Christian, it's alchemical. And that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but this nonetheless is the case. The short answer to the implied question there, is there a relationship between these ideas and this corn god, debt god idea? Is yes, there is. There's a very direct one. In fact, one of the chapters in Grid of the Gods addresses the parallels in thinking between medieval doctrines of sacrifice in the medieval Latin Church and, of all people, the Aztecs. Okay? The conceptualization of sacrifice is always the same. And it's always been opposed as a kind of a black alchemy. It's always been opposed by a kind of, for want of a better expression, a kind of good alchemy, a kind of alchemy based on the notions of love, of communion, and so on and so forth. This is a huge, huge story, and I mean, we barely even begin the story in Grid of the Gods. We're doing another book right now where we're exploring this logic and this connection a lot more deeply. But again, I want to stress that this is alchemy in the fullest and truest and deepest senses in both its black and its good forms, in that you are dealing with financial alchemy in both forms, you're dealing with a spiritual alchemy in both forms, and you're ultimately dealing with a physics. And, it's what I said in Babylon's Banksters. You have a physics of closed systems and of debt, and that's being sponsored by a certain group of people, and then you have a physics of open systems and a corresponding financial system, and that's being sponsored by other kinds of people. So this is a very, very old story, and I hope I've answered your questions. I'm trying to answer them as much as I can without spilling too many of the beans that I'm currently involved in researching.
Yes, I believe you have. A little further along with with temples. How exactly, you mentioned that there have been written texts about temples functioning as low-level transmitters.
Uh-huh.
How exactly did they transmit? Did they transmit to remote areas, or did they transmit from temple to temple? Could they transmit to person?
No, it would have been, this technology would have been temple to temple. In Babylon's Banksters, and the reason I say that is I'm basing my research off of a research done by a German engineer by the name of Professor Dr. Konstantin Meil, all right, and a big, thick treatise of his that he wrote on scalar waves, in which he examines ancient temples from the standpoint of engineering optimization problems, and notices that these temples were constructed as very, very simple radio frequency resonant cavities, all right? And that means that they were probably used both to receive and transmit in a very, very narrow frequency band, and could probably only have transmitted and received by by means of telegraphy. In other words, by means of simple pulses, much like Morse code. And that means that it would have been temple to temple.
Okay. If you don't mind, another question. You also described the Egyptian pyramids as being an ancient weapon.
Yes.
Able to resonate possible destructive frequencies.
Yes.
Enough to annihilate a planet.
Yes.
Okay. And also in Africa, there are less known structures, but with similar frequency type properties. If you know about them, if you will please comment on the African stone circles that Michael Tellinger has written about. Okay.
Let me clarify what I've done in my pyramid research. I have never argued that the Egyptian pyramids, plural, were weapons. My weapon hypothesis is confined solely and exclusively to the Great Pyramid, and for very, very specific reasons. To kind of sum those reasons up, the Great Pyramid has so many inbuilt dimensional analogs of various geometric properties of local celestial space, in addition to analogs of various constants of physics and so on and so forth, that to argue, as does Chris Dunn, that it is merely a machine for the production of power does not, to my mind, adequately explain then why you would need all of these dimensional analogs. So my argument comes down basically to the idea that you've got here a coupled harmonic oscillator to the geometry of local space. In other words, it is built intentionally for the purpose of manipulating the physical medium of local space directly. All right? And that means it could have most definitely a weapons application. The other pyramids, both in Egypt and around the world, I think may have been built for a machine-like purpose, yes, but a rather different one. And without getting into details, that is the reason I wrote the book, The Grid of the Gods, the one that just came out. In fact, it's so new, it just came out. My publisher just received the copies of the book yesterday, so I haven't even received my own copies of the book yet. That's how recent it's out. But my intention in writing that book is to flesh out the ideas of how other structures manipulate the physical medium and why they were built and so on and so forth. So that was the intention of The Grid of the Gods, and I hope that kind of clarifies your question and answers it.
I tell you, the subject is so fascinating. Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome.
Dr. Farrell, this is Patrick. I'll start off with an easy question. Mm-hmm. Are you of the opinion that phase conjugate, tunable lasers, or other advanced weaponry speculated to be in existence today might be approaching the power and destructive capabilities of ancient pyramid technologies?
Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
That's the easy one.
Yeah, that's opening Pandora's box. The short answer is, do I think such things approach that power today? The short answer is yes, and the reason why is that there are a number, and in fact I have a white paper in the members only area on my website where I talk about various patents of a very interesting nature concerning directed energy weaponry that began to be taken out in this country in the mid-1950s. So in other words, the known technology is very, very old. Now, you asked specifically about phase conjugate lasers. Phase conjugation is a very interesting, unique phenomenon that really made it into the open physics literature in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And for those listeners that don't know what phase conjugation is, to put it very simply, if you take a beam of light and shine it at a mirror at a certain angle, of course, you all know the standard optics, is that outgoing beam will reflect away from the mirror at exactly the same angle as the incoming incident beam, and do so according to the laws of the inverse square law. In other words, it will diminish with the square of the distance. The intensity will diminish. All right, the phase conjugate mirror essentially takes that incoming beam and time reverses it. It, in effect, reflects the beam back onto itself so that the inverse square law is reversed. So the beam actually intensifies and is reflected back upon the target that's producing the beam in the first place. So to say a phase conjugate laser, we're dealing with an even more sophisticated notion. And in my opinion, the short answer to that has to be yes. The perfect phase conjugate mirror for that type of thing would be a plasma. And, as I've written in a number of my books, plasmas have peculiar properties all their own. And there's no doubt in my mind, therefore, Patrick, that they have been investigating, among many other things in regard to plasma, that they've been very quietly and off the books, and part of their black projects, been investigating the use of plasmas as phase conjugate mirrors. And that would, of course, produce incredibly powerful weapons. So, yeah, do I think that they could possibly exist? Absolutely.
Okay. I'm not sure if this is related, but you might have mentioned Dr. Wood's work in passing somewhere. I came across an interesting passage in your Giza Death Star Destroyed book, and your quote was, "Any weapon using interferometry as a means to establish a disruptive standing wave in the medium would be a very powerful weapon." Yes. Now, as you and Dr. Paul Laviette, Tom Bearden, and in Dr. Wood's book suggest, it appears to be a directed energy weapon. Could you speculate how dustification of the towers and the anomalies with toasted cars and rustifying metals might have been somehow a negative transmutation, or in other words, the dissociation of matter by canceling out its harmonic connection to the physical realm?
Oh, boy.
That's the hard one.
Oh, boy. I have deliberately refrained in public appearances from commenting on Dr. Judy Wood's work for a variety of personal reasons. So my answer here is going to be short. Is it possible for an electromagnetic interferometry-based weapon to produce the kinds of... Hello? Did I...
No, I'm here.
No,
oh,
okay.
Okay. I thought my screen went down. The dustification that Dr. Wood talks about could definitely be the effect of an interferometry producing a resonant beat frequency effect within the various materials properties of those buildings, that those buildings would not have been able to damp. In other words, you would have a kind of molecular sonic disruption, all right? The same principle, in my opinion, could produce resonant effects in the cars that you see that are toasted, because there are certain things in cars that are not affected by torsion waves, which I think is what, in effect, we're dealing with here. And I do realize that Dr. Wood does not give much credit in her book, at least as far as I'm aware. I have not been able to finish the whole book, so I may be saying things that do not reflect her current state of research. So if that's the case, please understand I haven't been able to finish reading the whole book. But in my opinion, aluminum is one of those things that, according to Russian research, damps the effects of torsion. And I think you're seeing with some of these toasted cars, with the engine blocks remaining intact, with other parts of the car just being literally melted to nothing, I think you're looking at similar kinds of resonant effects there. I think when she talks about some of the on-the-ground witnesses that record being picked up and literally levitated several feet away from where they were by some sort of pressure, by some sort of wave, again, that you're looking at effects of this kinds of technology. So the bottom line for me is, I think that hers is the only hypothesis that adequately attempts to account for all the different kinds of damage that we see in New York City with respect to the World Trade Centers. I do think that we are looking at some sort of electromagnetic interferometry-based weapon that was used. I know that Dr. Wood does not, in her book, herself speculate as to who pulled that trigger and why. I have my own suspicions about who and why, but that's a rather different argument than the one that she's trying to make.
We respect your hesitance to speak too much in the open, but she did mention something that caught me from a transmutation standpoint. She mentioned that a lot more zinc was found in the dust than could have been accounted for with the aluminum, other metals. It seems to have transmuted into zinc.
It may have been the case. Again, I haven't finished reading all of her book. I don't know, therefore, what the state of her latest research is. I don't, and therefore it's difficult for me to comment on that aspect of it. I don't personally think that we need to go to explanations of possible transmutations. But then again, as I say, I have not read her book in its entirety yet, so I haven't come across that aspect of the data. And if there is data to suggest that there was transmutational effects occurring, then yeah, we have to look even more closely at the type of weapon that might have produced that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farrell.
Thank you.
Joseph, I've got a couple of easy questions for you here after the...
Okay.
This is Uranus, by the way. Have proposed that there are survivors from a cosmic war, elites with an agenda. Mm-hmm. And you've also proposed that there are two groups of these elites. One wanting a closed system, and they don't want us to figure things out. And the second one is an open system where they do want us to figure things out. Okay, here's my questions. Who are these elite, and are they on or off the planet? Do they own the planet? And if so, what are the implications of this, especially legally? And are they related to us?
My suspicion is both of these elites are definitely on the planet. They may be off the planet or connected with portions of them off the planet, but my model has always been to assume that they're on this planet. The closed system people are definitely the ones that are predominant. They're the most visible. They're the ones that we associate with, the large banking family dynasties, going all the way back to Venice and those times during the Guelph Ghibelline dispute in the Holy Roman Empire. So that elite has been here, I think, all along. They have certainly been the most successful in promoting their agenda. There have been allusions from time to time that the other elite is here as well, but they have been much less successful, in my opinion anyway, in promoting their agenda. So much so that I find it difficult today to find evidence that they are powerful enough even to be noticed. They may be. There are people that are arguing that they are here and that they are being rather successful. the other difficulty I have is I cannot look at any group being proposed, and I'll be very blunt and I'll be very honest here, and this will put me at odds with many people writing on this subject. But I do not see or identify with any of the groups being proposed, the followers of Horus, the Shemsu Horror, Isaac Asimov's second foundation idea, all of these things. I cannot identify any of these groups as being particularly good, because one of the consequences of the idea that the physical medium and consciousness are so directly interfaced is that you do not need, by the nature of the case, that kind of thing does not need any special revelations or institutions to represent it, because everybody does this by dint of being human to begin with.
Correct, yes.
So I have great difficulty in looking at any of the groups that others are proposing as being the good elite. I have difficulty looking at any of them as being that good elite. They may have good intentions, but that doesn't necessarily make them a good elite. Because by the nature of the case, I think the so-called good elite is a kind of a democratized elite. It's an elite of shared concepts, broad concepts, if you want to call it the Philosophia Perennis, use that old designation for it, or the Theologia of Priscus, the ancient theology, if you want to use that designation for it. That elite, I think, has existed simply by dint of the fact that there are people that adhere to those principles. It is not a formal or an institutional elite. That's why it's hard to pin it down. And I think that those who are looking to do so have the wrong model to begin with. They haven't understood the physics of it adequately. So I think, anytime you're pointing fingers at this group or that group and saying, well, that's the good elite, by the nature of the case, you've already damaged your case that they are. I hope that makes sense. That's about as open as I dare be with this subject right now.
Yes, I can understand that and very much appreciate it. But the other thing I'm interested in is who owns the planet and what's the implications of this. You referred briefly to that earlier, and that's about patents.
Yes. Well, this goes back to the idea that if we take certain ancient stories at their word, at their face value, and assume, number one, that this planet was visited by someone out there, let's call them our genetic cousins, and that they came here, they set up shop here, they started to, quite literally, to terraform the planet, and agriculture is a form of terraforming. Let's just be very blunt. They started to terraform the planet and engineered us into existence. Well, yeah, under most systems of patent law, that would make us property. Now, as to who owns it now, I certainly think that the bankster elite thinks they own it. Okay.
Yes.
I think this is their understanding of their own station in life. I view them as nothing but parasites, but they view themselves as, sort of demigods and doing all of this stuff, for the greater good of the humanity in spite of all the lives that they ruin and misfortune and havoc that they wreak, I think their attitude is, well, we own the planet. And in fact, several years ago, that elite had a gathering of like minds in Colorado called the World Wilderness Congress, in which they were proposing a new system of currency based on all the collateralized wilderness land of the world. So in other words, to even propose such a harebrained scheme, and of course it's all coming out of the Brain Trust of the Rothschilds, all the familiar names. Well, even to propose such a kooky idea, you have to assume to a certain extent that you own it to begin with in order to collateralize it in that fashion. All right, so you've got a certain vanity with these people that just knows no bounds, quite literally.
It also sounds like they're the victims of their own social engineering in a way.
They're the victim. Yes, they are. This is a very good point that you make, and I've pointed it out any number of times on the Bite Show. When you surround yourself by people of a like mind so much, you begin to think in terms of your own box. In other words, these elites, I think, are having difficulty in dealing with what's happening in the world right now precisely because they put themselves into their own box for so long they can't think outside of it anymore, and they don't even know where to find the analysts and advisors to do that either. So, to a certain extent, they're using old models that I think are breaking down very rapidly. As for who really owns the planet, let's assume we have those genetic cousins. Well, if they're still out there, then they would certainly have a claim to, and given their behavior as recorded in some ancient texts, they're little better than the banksters, and probably think that they have a claim to it too. So, it's anybody's guess. I don't care who owns the planet, because ultimately, it's about the fact that you cannot own the person who says I.
Yes.
And you have only to look at some of the statements of Alexander Solzhenitsyn that he made to the Soviet magistrates that put him in the gulag to see that you can take everything from a man and even dampen and lessen his will, but you can never take that person that says I.
Correct.
It's another way of saying what Christ said in the Gospels. Fear him who can kill the soul, not the body, and that's the point. Ultimately, if you look at this ancient perennial philosophy and understand it correctly, not in the New Age nonsense that's floating about now, that at death you get reabsorbed into the cosmic all. That the indications in that perennial philosophy of personal immortality are fairly clear. So I think you have to look at it that way. We're literally in a kind of a spiritual war, but it's a very different one than I think most people are really looking at and perceiving for what it really is.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. That we acknowledge that it is part of our spiritual path and discipline that counterbalance this, and that involves us taking on our own spiritual discipline and power.
Yes.
So, Thank you for that very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Uranus. And I guess it's a matter of trying to control the soul by linking or disassociating the soul to the physical, which they possibly created. So they possibly created us, but they try to link us to the actual body, hence by controlling the soul. We're moving to the Earth Changes section now. The first question, Joseph, we have is, in a previous interview on the Byte radio show, you were talking about energy weapons, and you stated that if you saw earthquake swarms, then that would be more likely indicative of the use of energy weapons. Since November 2010, we have been seeing earthquake swarms in the Gulf of Aden, and recently in 2011 in Puerto Rico region, Dominican Republic, and the Virgin Islands region. Do you think these effects of energy weapons, and more importantly, what purpose?
I think they very well could be, and I'm glad you asked the question, because I've been blogging a lot lately on this topic. I've posted a few members-only papers on the topic on my website, and I'm not done by any stretch of the imagination. The reason I think, and the reason I stated this about swarms of earthquakes was, let's put ourselves in the position of having invented a technology that could produce earthquakes, all right? Now, the problem that we immediately have is we do not know the actual observational effects of our technology. So what we're going to have to do, like it or not, is we are going to have to produce earthquakes within a certain region of the world, within a certain intensity of energy output, and so on and so forth, and in certain areas where the plate tectonics differ, in order to observe and experimentally verify and validate the various models that we're operating with. So in other words, you literally are turning the entire planet into a laboratory. This is why I predicted that if we're going to look for a sign of the use of an earthquake technology, that we look for clusters or swarms of earthquakes, because quite literally, you're going to have to assemble empirical data in order to verify or disprove whatever models of tectonics, of geophysics that you're operating with. So I think it's very odd that, yeah, we are seeing clusters of earthquakes in particular regions. And could they be the signatures of a technology? Yes, but there are other things we would look for in those cases. If this is a technology producing these things, then we're also going to have to be looking for strange sorts of atmospheric effects, kind of glowing light effects or auroral effects in the atmosphere in these regions occurring prior to whatever earthquakes occur, and occurring within, I'd say, 72 to 24 hours prior to whatever earthquakes go off. And there are very specific reasons I say that. They're in a paper that I wrote on my website for the members only. But basically, the bottom line I'm trying to get at here is the reason I said look for swarms of earthquakes. Well, that's telling you that they could be experimenting and collecting data, and that's literally why I proposed that in the first place. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Joseph. Yes. Another question I had was, Richard Hoagland, based on his research recently, seems to subscribe to solar issues or problems coming in the next few years. Ancient texts and prophecies seems to suggest this. Even the Nazi symbol, the swastika, was in many cultures a symbol for a revolving sun.
Yes.
With strange behavior from the elite, including doomsday seed vaults, secret underground bases from researcher Richard Sauder, as well as rumor that the elites are relocating to the southern hemisphere and buying large amounts of land, several thousands of feet above sea level. What is your take or potential for a solar cataclysm, and your take on the 2012 meme?
Well, I'm not a 2012 researcher. I haven't studied it. I'm not on that bandwagon. I tend to be, by nature, very suspicious of eschatologies that predict the end of the world on certain dates. I'm just philosophically not able to wrap my mind around that. So 2012 has never been a subject that interests me. I haven't ever really explored the question. The question of solar activity is different in that, and again, I don't know what Mr. Hoagland is saying lately about that. I don't know his process of reasoning behind it. My own would be this. Anytime that you're dealing with a physics that can literally engineer the physical medium itself, then as a consequence of this physics, any large rotating mass in local space that you're engineering is going to be a natural resonator of those longitudinal waves that you're putting out in the physical medium. So in other words, let's say you're playing around with HAARP and you're producing certain resonance effects in the entire planet Earth. By the nature of the case, then those resonant effects could conceivably be translated to other rotating masses in local celestial space. And the biggest one, obviously, is the sun. And let's remember something else I said earlier. I mentioned earlier that plasmas are natural phase conjugate mirrors. Well, what's the sun? It's a large, gigantic, rotating ball of plasma. And rotating balls of plasma. If you go back to my book, The Nazi International, and to what the Nazi scientist down in Argentina, Dr. Ronald Richter, actually said to the U.S. Air Force, you can read the documents, I've got them in that book. What he actually said that he was really doing down in Argentina had nothing whatsoever to do with controlling thermonuclear fusion. What he was trying to figure out was the exact mechanism that, in his mind, made a rotating plasma a natural transducer of the zero-point energy. And what's the zero-point energy? Well, in another way of putting it, is simply the energy of the fabric of local space-time. So in other words, the sun, by dint of this kind of physics thinking, of this kind of physics theorizing, is a natural resonator of whatever waves are taking place in the physical medium. So if you are playing around with HAARP, producing resonant effects in the sun, the other thing that you're going to look for as you're doing this are exactly what sorts of effects occur in the sun as you're playing around with this stuff down here on Earth. So I think my own explanation would be you have very possibly, and I emphasize the word possibly because this is a chain of speculation based on certain concepts in physics. They may be true, they may not be true, and the only way to prove or disprove them true scientifically is precisely to do what? To experiment. So, we may be looking at yet more side effects of human technology, not some sort of cycle that was observed or predicted or so on and so forth by dint of Mayan astronomers about the year 2012. That, to me, much more than any speculation about 2012 is the really big story and the really frightening story, because that means if you learn how to manipulate those effects, if they conclusively prove to their own satisfaction that they are indeed getting resonant effects in the sun, then the next step is to be able to learn how to manipulate them, or to put it in much starker and more brutal terms, to target them.
Thank you, Joseph. Just a quick one. The expanding Earth theory. Nature seems to have a common rule that things grow in sizes. People grow from a baby to an adult. Plants grow. And
yes.
Could the planet also grow in size, but instead of a period of, say, 90 years, which is observable, perhaps the planet grows over thousands of years?
Well, there are various physicists. I know that there's a lot of New Age, what I like to call New Age Gnostic nonsense out there about the growing planet and so on and so forth. I don't pay much attention to that. There are serious physicists that have proposed that the Earth is very, very infinitesimally growing incrementally in mass and to a certain extent in actual volume, all right? And I'm thinking largely in terms of the physicist Pascual Jordan, the famous German physicist, very, very crucial in the development of quantum mechanics, as a matter of fact, and also, incidentally, an ardent Nazi. Another physicist by the name of Ott Christian Hilgenberg, another German, also proposed this idea of a growing Earth and slightly changing physical constants. Those are the people I pay attention to. Is it possible? Yes, I think it is. Because, again, let's go back to what I just got done saying. If you have a physical medium, a vacuum, zero-point energy that is constantly producing energy, then a large rotating mass is a natural, let's repeat this word, a natural transducer of that energy. So it stands to reason that if it's doing this, then slowly, incrementally, over time, it is going to change in terms of its mass. In other words, it's going to change in terms of its physical characteristics. It's, in a word, it's going to grow.
Great. Thank you, Joseph. Mm-hmm. Giuseppe, you have some questions for Joseph.
Yes. Joseph, what do you think... one second. What do you think of the theory that the moon is not a natural satellite, Did I hit on something that you don't want to?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
Well, Isaac Newton himself made the statement that the moon is the only thing that gives me a headache.
Oh, okay.
So, let's just look at the moon and I love the way that Isaac Asimov, the famous scientist and science fiction author, put it. The Earth has a moon that, in terms of the relative size of the satellite to the parent, is enormous. Okay. I mean, you look at the moons of the other planets, and they're these little specks in terms of the relationship of volume and mass to their parent planet. Our moon, on the other hand, is gigantic in comparison to the parent planet that it's partnered with, namely the Earth. So that we really live in a dual planetary system. All right, the Earth and Moon is really a dual planetary system. Now, to me, the problem here is that the standard model, the capture model for the moon, makes no physics sense. All right? And here's why. If we can imagine the warping of space-time that occurs around a large mass, Pace Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity. If we put a bowling ball on a trampoline, we have a two-dimensional analog, the trampoline being the analog of the kind of warping of four-dimensional space-time around a mass, all right? So if you can imagine an infinite number of trampoline surfaces all being warped by that bowling ball, that's the effect that a mass has on space-time. So let's use our trampoline surface and try to reproduce the capture model of the moon, okay? So let's take a ping pong ball or a softball, something smaller than the bowling ball, and roll it toward the bowling ball at a certain velocity. Now, what happens? Well, if you roll it slow enough, that softball is going to be captured by the bowling ball's gravity, and the orbit that it's going to take place around that bowling ball is going to be elliptical, all right? And as the softball approaches the bowling ball, it's going to accelerate. And that acceleration is going to be what produces that elliptical orbit, all right? Now, let's look at the moon, okay? If we look at the moon, the problem is that the thing is orbiting in almost a perfectly circular orbit. And in order for that to happen, in other words, instead of accelerating as it approaches the Earth, somebody has to be putting on the brakes. Okay? That's literally what you have to be doing. And in order to park it even more so into the position where only 60% of its surface is visible, and the same 60% of its surface, incidentally, is visible as it orbits on its own axis from the Earth's surface, that's even more difficult. So in other words, do the math here. Compute all the statistics of this happening just by chance. Number one, the physics of the capture model doesn't work. Someone put on the brakes. Now, what I'm telling you is it doesn't matter whether the moon itself is artificial or not. The problem is its orbit is. Okay? And if the orbit's artificial, then yeah, people ask me, have you ever seen a UFO? And I say, yeah, every time there's a full moon. There it is. There's really no other good way of putting it. And science has all sorts of ways of explaining all of this away, because God forbid that we should really accept what the science is telling us, and that is someone parked it there. Quite literally.
Okay, well, if that's the case, what do you think is its purpose?
Excellent idea. I have no idea. It could be as a natural defense barrier around the Earth, because let's face it, the moon absorbs an awful lot of punishment for us. It could be that. It could have been that it was used as some sort of base by whoever parked it there. I don't know. I have no idea. I think you have to entertain all possibilities. Once you really accept what the science and the physics is telling you about it, once you accept that, I think you have to accept all the possibilities and leave all of them open until you can get up there and find out just the heck what it is and what may be up there.
Well, NASA sent satellites up to the moon. They sent people up to the moon. What do you think is running NASA?
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. I tend to the view of Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra that there is some sort of covert group that's in charge of it. I do agree with them that at one point it looked like the Nazis were the most influential. At this point in time, I don't think that they are. It's somebody else, but who it is, I don't know. But I don't think that NASA is the friendly civilian space agency that we've all been told it is. I think that it's a cover. I do think that all the indications are that the United States has its own version of this breakaway civilization and has come up with some of these technologies. I think probably other nations have too. I think the Europeans have done so. I think certainly the Russians have done so. So I think you're looking at the possibility of several breakaway civilizations here, and they may or may not be in league with each other. They may or may not be at war with each other.
Okay, well, thank you for your answer.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I believe the next question is from Alton. No, that's for me. Okay. Next question is from myself, and I believe this might be from Cliff. What is your opinion of chemtrails, and what about Antarctica, the whole no-fly zone layer of secrecy over the South Pole? Joseph?
Well, chemtrails, again, are not a subject I've researched, so I really can't comment on them. I don't know that much about them. I have seen very unusual phenomenon with my own eyes in the skies where I used to live, that clearly were the signature of some sort of technology, but I simply have not researched chemtrails to have any sort of informed opinion about them. Antarctica, on the other hand, I strongly suspect that, in spite of what I said earlier about the post-war Nazis having a research base there, I do think they had something there. I do think that there is enough extremely suspicious activity going on down there vis-a-vis Lake Vostok and the Russians and more recent reports of strange maladies coming out of there. Something is going on there, and I add to that one final point, and that is that in Roswell and the Reich, at the very end of the book, I put out seismograms that were recorded by a German researcher that were taken in Antarctica. And I was astounded when I saw these things, because if they're legitimate, if they're genuine, then we're looking at enormous low-frequency wave activity spanning hours of activity that are not anything close to any sort of normal seismic activity. And so I'm left with one of two hypotheses, and this may be the explanation as to why there's a no-fly zone down there. I don't know. The one possibility is that we are looking at a wholly new phenomenon of geophysical activity, and there are no good models that the scientists have to explain it, or we are looking at the product of some human technology. The reason I mention that possibility is if you are testing some sort of geophysical technology, the perfect place to do so, where you would have very little effect on a human population and you would still be able to observe tectonic activity, surface activity, and so on, the perfect place would be Antarctica. And the way that you would observe it would be precisely from the air or by satellite. So that, to my mind, may be the most plausible explanation as to why there's a no-fly zone there.
Hi, Joseph. This is Lolly.
Hi, Lolly.
This next question is actually from Alton, who's been dropping in and out due to some storms in his part of the country. So I'll ask it on his behalf. He would like to know, he says, many consider HARP and similar projects of other governments around the world to be tools of domination and destruction, much as nuclear bombs were in the 20th century. What are your thoughts on HARP?
Well, I have to agree. I just posted a paper on how HARP-like technologies, and the paper was based actually upon the research of a Brazilian physicist. The technologies that these ionospheric heaters represent are technologies that you can model, and this is the important point. You can model a theoretical application or use for these technologies in precisely creating earthquakes and, for that matter, creating cyclonic activity. In other words, areas of low pressure that you can steer weather systems by this means. So, are they a technology of domination? I think so. I've always found it very suspicious that the Soviet Union experienced a raft of very devastating earthquakes in the weeks leading up to German reunification. And at that time in history, Germany did have its hands on a HARP-like technology, ESCAT, in northern Norway, but it's predominantly a German-run project. So you have Germany with access to this type of technology, the United States, Japan has its own version, Russia certainly has its own version, and Brazil has been working in this area as well. So you've got, I think you have here a new technology. I think it's even deadlier than nuclear bombs in a certain sense because it can produce the same amount of energy output as a nuclear bomb. In fact, if you take the argument that the Japan earthquake was a product of a technology, while a 9.1 on the Richter scale is far, far larger in terms of energy output than the largest hydrogen bomb that was ever detonated, which was detonated by the Soviet Union. So yes, this technology is very scary, and like I said before, the problem with it is Mother Nature provides you with perfect plausible deniability. The only people that are going to know that they're in a shooting war with this technology are people that have the technology and have developed the means to detect that technology being used by somebody else. The rest of us, they're not talking to.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question from Alton. Given your educational background, how do you view the electric universe theory from the perspective of the Christian Bible?
Well, number one, I'm in favor of the electric universe theory. In other words, the plasma cosmology of Hannes Alfvén and Anthony Peratt and some others that have written about this type of cosmology. I do like that cosmology immensely because it's much, in my opinion, the explanatory power of it is much greater than the standard physics model, which comes out of an elaboration of the implications of general relativity. But I do not, and have never in my books, attempted to allow any one ancient textual tradition, including the biblical, to steer my research. My academic background in it is one thing. My adherence and commitment to it is very, very far from what people might think. I do not consider myself an adherent of that school. So to me, it's one of many ancient textual traditions that provides some clues, but I do not use it as a canon or standard by which to judge all the rest.
Okay, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lolly. Joseph, we only have about 5-6 questions left, so we might have a quick 2-minute break, and then we'll be back to wrap it up.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm having fun. Good questions.
We had a lot more, but
Good answers.
I hope so. I hope so.
Did you say you come back, Joseph?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Oh, great.
Okay, we're here with Joseph Farrell. His website is geezerdeathstar.com. Please pay for his dinner and donate at geezerdeathstar.com. The next question we have is from Patrick.
Yes, Dr. Farrell, your discussions often suggest that physical alchemy, the transmutation of materials, as well as increasing longevity, might be possible, if not probable. Though some hermetical texts delve into high-temperature transmutations, and recent technology suggests efficacy with high-voltage electrics and plasma, could you speculate that at least through some organic-based procedure, true alchemy could be done at low temperatures, say, as some sages suggest, egg-hatching temperatures?
Well, if you look at, I forget which book it is, I think it was The Philosopher's Stone, or, I think it was Philosopher's Stone. I, in fact, go into articles where it appears that the DNA helix has certain sorts of not necessarily transmutational properties, but that they do have unusual physical properties that occur at, so to speak, room temperature or egg hatching temperatures, as you say, rather than high heat or high electrical stress. And if we look at another phenomenon, which is cold fusion, you have transmutations being affected there, again, at more or less room temperatures. In other words, at temperatures that are not anywhere near what standard thermonuclear transformational models suggest is necessary. And again, that I should point out that even Dr. Richter down in Argentina in the 1950s was making similar claims long before cold fusion ever became a debated and hot phenomenon within the scientific literature. So, yeah, I think all the indications observationally are there that these things are possible. The problem is that we don't really have right now a good model as to why these things are happening. There's no theory that explains or accounts for all of them as yet, at least not that I'm aware of. If there is, it's being kept very hidden, very quiet. But I think the data is sufficient there that we have to take a very serious, hard and questioning look at the standard models of transformational physics.
Okay. I don't know if you've heard Jay Widener's recent interviews.
No.
We had one with him, and he was on the trail of Orm's monatomic gold. Yes. He switched actually to the tincture type.
Uh-huh.
And I'm referencing a recently released book on the internet. It's called the Book of Aquarius.
Uh-huh.
It gives detailed instructions to develop a tincture of the Philosopher's Stone, and it poses that urine is the starting point to capture and concentrate or purify the quintessence or life energy, later to be combined with silver or gold in the typical Philosopher's Stone. There were several clues in hermetical texts that allude to the substance being cast out by servants,
yes,
which indicate that it may have been something like urine. Do you think it's possible that this concoction could contain prime matter continually ingested and expelled from the human body and used as the basic building block for a homegrown version of the stone?
Well, it's really hard for me to comment on that because I haven't read the text you're referring to. I've encountered similar statements in alchemical authors like Paracelsus or Agrippa and so on and so forth. But even if I recall correctly, even there's a statement in Albert the Great, but my memory may be kind of shoddy on that one. But the problem I have with that is that alchemical texts are very, very difficult sometimes to decode. And if they're talking about actual human waste or if they're using that as code for something else, it's very, very difficult for me to decide at this point. I've run across texts like that myself. I haven't figured out what to make of them yet. I do think that there is a profound, little understood relationship between DNA and the physical medium. I don't think that there's enough in the scientific literature to permit very much speculation right now. I could crawl way out on a limb, but I'd rather not do so until I know a little bit more. I do know Jay. I've talked to him a couple of times, but I haven't heard his recent interviews and his recent thinking about all this, so, it's even difficult for me to comment on that score.
Okay. Might alchemy of the mind and spirit be a condition required to accomplish such physical alchemy?
Yes. In fact, alchemical texts are fairly clear in that respect. And again, I think it's because of their understanding that consciousness directly affects the physical medium in some way. So yes, I think that that's entirely possible. I think it's, in fact, I'll go a little bit further and say it's not only possible, but it's likely that somehow this plays a role.
Well, thank you very much. I've got my retort all warmed up, and I'll let you know in about a year.
Let me know. Let me know.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more question. Dr. Farrell, you, or more often, Georgianne Hughes, often refer to a template in the Bite Show interviews. Can you elaborate on the meaning of the template? You seem to discuss inorganic, like structure or architecture, as well as DNA for template manifestation. I'm confused about the term template.
Okay. If you've listened to the Bite Show, you've heard me explain what I mean by a template many, many times. I'm using that in a specific reference to the idea of electromagnetic interferometry. In other words, when you beam two or more beams of electromagnetic energy, usually of different frequencies, into an area where they all intersect, they will produce or establish a pattern of interference, an interference grating that is a template of action. Let me draw the analogy. If you stand by a smooth pond and hold a handful of pebbles of different sizes and toss them up into the air so that they land in the pond, each pebble is going to impact, they're going to send out waves, and you're going to take a snapshot of those waves as they intersect at a certain time, all right? That's what a template is in terms of electromagnetic interferometry, because when you're taking beams and interfering them in a certain area of different frequencies, those are going to set up what's called a beat frequency. In other words, it's going to set up a pattern of interference just like in the pond, only it's going to be three-dimensional, all right? And that pattern of interference is going to produce an effect, an action on anything within that pattern of interference. So in other words, depending on how you construct that pattern of interference, it's going to produce a certain action. That's what I mean by a template, all right? Now, the reason that I think DNA is related to this is that if you take the idea of the physical medium as giving off longitudinal waves, a longitudinal wave is a pressure wave, like a sound wave, all right? It's a sound wave or a pressure wave within the physical medium itself. DNA, well, let's back up. Any material object in a certain kind of physics emerges as a result of this interference pattern, all right? So, in other words, DNA is a result of a certain kind of interference pattern at the most basic fundamental physics level. And therefore, it's a natural oscillator. It's a natural resonator of certain types of patterns. All right? This is all, again, about fundamental physics. It's about waves in the medium. To use the ancient cosmological expression, it's about the music of the spheres. All right? That's exactly what they're talking about. So on that view, any any mass is a natural resonator. Anything that is a spiraling structure is a natural resonator of it, and DNA particularly, as we know, is a spiraling structure. Well, why is that a resonator of it? Because torsion is the fundamental kind of wave given out by large rotating masses. Torsion, if you imagine what torsion is, it's a big, huge, spiraling, folding, pleating wave in the fabric of space-time. It's like you take an empty soda can and wring it like a dish rag in your hands. That produces a spiraling, folding, pleating motion in the can, and the can here represents space-time. So in other words, at a very fundamental level, DNA is a natural resonator of those kinds of waves in the physical medium because it's in the same shape, it's in the same structural form as torsion waves. And therefore, it's the most susceptible, let's put it that way, to the influence of those kinds of waves, and it in turn could possibly be the most natural manipulator of them in a certain subtle sense. So again, we're sort of back to fundamental conceptual links between all of these things. Now, that said, I should note one very important thing for your listeners. If you ask a physicist about the effects of torsion, he will either laugh and dismiss it because it's not part of the standard model of contemporary physics, or if he's more informed, he will tell you that the effects of torsion are very, very, very small mathematically, so that most physicists don't even take them into account in their calculations at all. So, we have to remember here that we're talking both fundamental concepts, but also concepts that are not on the radar screen for most modern physicists.
I understand that, and the rotation of the planets and moons also have an effect.
Sure.
As far as templates go, can you discuss the significance of topological representation of a human physiology and dimensions in the Temple of Luxor? Is that a stationary mass that also performs as a template radiating this energy? Okay.
Whoa. Let's back up. I'm assuming that you're referring to some of the ideas of Schwaller de Lubitsch.
Yes.
All right. Schwaller was a mathematician, and he was principally concerned in his published writings with showing that numbers in the Egyptian mind represented geometrical functions. Geometry is not the same thing as topology. All right? Topology is a higher mathematics that is, so to speak, geometry in any number of dimensions. In other words, it allows you to take an object in 3 dimensions and via a particular kind of mathematical technique translate that object into 4 or more dimensions. All right? So in other words, topology is a very, very highly abstracted version of what de Lubitsch was saying in his works. So first of all, it's important to understand that he's not talking about topology, although he could have, because that, I think, was really what he understood. When I'm talking about topological metaphors of the medium, I'm talking about something very, very deep that is not specifically connected to any particular tradition of the manifestation of that metaphor, be it Egyptian, be it Vedic, be it Greek, be it Hermetic, what have you. In fact, I talk about the topological metaphor of the medium at great length in the book that just came out, Grid of the Gods, because it is crucial. It has been crucial to my thinking all along, all the way back to the Giza Death Star books, even through the Nazi books. But it is such a highly abstract mathematical language that I think the reason that Schwaller put it in numerical terms was because even then it's difficult for most people to grasp. I mean, if you've read Schwaller, you know that it takes a while to sit down and absorb what he's saying. You can do the same things that Schwaller does in The Temple of Man and do it topologically, but to show how it emerges topologically, you'd have to have possession of a great deal of abstract formal mathematics, and most people just get turned off by that stuff. But so no, what I'm saying is that Schwaller is not talking about the same thing I'm talking about. He's not talking directly in terms of topology, although, like I said, as a mathematician, he certainly knew about it, and he certainly could have, but he would have lost his audience. I think we've reached the stage, and the reason I'm talking about it is that drawing the connections between these various traditions and showing that this is really what they're talking about, and that this is a legacy of a high science. The reason I'm doing that is I think it's time now that we start doing it, and there's aspects of it, as I've said to other people on other interviews, there's aspects of this that I will never talk about because it is truly, truly very, very dangerous stuff.
I guess I'm on my own then. Thank you very much.
With respect to the dangerous stuff, yes, you are.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Farrell. Mm-hmm. And for our final question, we would like to bring it full circle and have Lolly ask about the magic of social engineering once again. Mm-hmm. Lolly?
Joseph, I'm going back to some of your comments that you made earlier in this interview and in talking with Georgianne Hughes on the Bite Show. Uh-huh. I really resonated to the elegant simplicity of your counterspell, create beauty. Mm-hmm. Writing poems, baking pies, creating art or music seems to me to be high magic. The use of It is.
Yes.
Good. The use of consciousness, will, and intent for good. Mm-hmm. So do you during these times when we're bombarded by negativity and the tomfoolery of the elite, is creating beauty the ultimate in rebellion, in taking a stand for life and all that is pure and good? I would love to hear more of your thoughts on this.
Well, I think it is. I myself, I write music. I've shared it with close friends and family and so on. I do a lot in my personal life that is very far removed from what I write about. Some of what I write about is very beautiful and good, and some of it is very ugly and wicked. And I write about that part of it simply to warn people that, this physics stuff is more or less neutral. It's when you add into the mix the consciousness aspect of it that it can become either very, very good or very, very destructive. The primacy in all ancient systems has always been that this is ultimately a good thing, all right? And therefore, their emphasis has always been that you do good, you do compassionate, loving things, you focus on beauty, you focus on just simple acts of kindness to those that God puts in your life. God, I don't think, requires us to love humanity. In other words, love is never given to the great abstractions. It's given to specific people that are brought to us. And that's our sphere of activity. The other thing I do, and it's kind of up to each individual how they take this, but I'm not one of those people that likes to comment on contemporary events and make a comment every day about things happening that particular day. I look for patterns, but I don't watch television news. In fact, my television is very rarely ever on. I just don't let that stuff into my life. I try to take a big step back and look at the big picture And that way I don't get upset at all the little things happening. And if I hear of the other thing that I advise people to do is, if you see or hear of suffering or something going on in the world, you target your good thoughts and prayers to those people. But ultimately, you're dealing with those in your life that God sends you. You certainly keep your view universal and try to target specific people. The people suffering in Japan or Libya or wherever they're suffering right now, Joplin. But to me, the great abstractions only remain abstractions unless you also couple them with specific acts of love and kindness to specific people in your life. I don't know how else to put it.
No, that's well stated. So is it all of these little things and some of the bigger things we do for the people that we love with that will, conscious will and intent? Would you consider that alchemy?
Oh, yes, of course. Alchemy means nothing more or less than transmutation, transformation. It can be referred to transformation of consciousness, soul, of physical elements. It refers to all sorts of transformations in its broadest sense. So, you don't even really need to call it alchemy, although I choose to call it that because I think that this is one of the more ancient legacies of whatever it was way back when, before humanity got diverted into dead gods and sacrifices and the current mess that we've been in and have been in for a few millennia. But if it means simply transformation, it means, first of all, transforming yourself, assuming some humility and some charity. And, most people have the wrong idea of what humility is. Humility is simply seeing things exactly as they are, including yourself. And once you have that, and then begin to look at, not only the good things but the warts, then you're in a position to deal with them and deal effectively with them. So yeah, it's personal transformation. It's basically the ancient metaphor of this physics, of this consciousness transformation has always been love. It has always been love.
Right.
And if you do not have that, then you misconstrue what those metaphors are saying, and then it becomes a technique of manipulation, a technique of power, a technique to acquire hegemony, and it becomes an obsession. So it's very, very simple what we're talking about. You can either go down the black path or you can go down the loving path, and that's kind of it for me.
Thanks very much for your thoughts. They're actually, given all that you've talked about in terms of DNA and how we receive, or how DNA both receives and can be a manipulator of the material around us, that just those simple loving acts create change within, around, and out into, the wider world. It's where our power is.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lolly. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for your time tonight, Dr. Farrell.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
The Latin meaning of the word doctor is to teach. But to teach what? Oscar Wilde once said, "A man who does not think for himself does not think at all." Your willingness to think and continually question why things are is what sets you apart from other academic doctors. Without questioning, one cannot obtain veritas, and without veritas, how can one truly teach? Dr. Farrell, thank you for teaching us some veritas tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope that the answers have been worthy of your consideration, but I've certainly enjoyed it.
They have. On behalf of Fox and all the members of the WebBot Forum, we thank you, sir. We have one more request from Lolly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, this request comes from the roundtable that just asked you questions. We want to know if you can play something for us.
Unfortunately, I can't. My keyboard is in the other room. I haven't had time to practice in about 5 years, and my keyboard my keyboard is also. I couldn't play chopsticks right now. I'd probably practice. And unfortunately, my keyboard has 3 notes on it that stick. I mean, it's real old, and it's no longer even really playable. The music that I have on my computer, I've been trying to figure out, to be quite honest with you, how to upload it to the members only area, because I get a lot of people asking me, can we hear some of your music compositions? And I'm trying to figure out how to do it, but I haven't been able to figure it out yet. Otherwise, I'd be more than happy to share my 18th century proclivities with everybody.
Well, I think we'd enjoy that if you could. Okay, so they're asking me if you can't play a song or play a piece of music, have you got a poem that you'd like to share with us?
Not handy. Again, all my books. I'm looking at my shelf right now to see if I've got anything of a short nature out here, and unfortunately, my Oxford English Poetry Anthology I haven't unpacked because I don't see it. Okay. So all I have is a collection of Auden's collected longer poems over on the other side of the room, and that would take all night. I could do maybe, if I could find Cardinal Wolsey's soliloquy from Henry VIII, that would be a good one. You know, that one, how does it go? This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hope, and tomorrow blossoms, and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. Then comes a frost, a killing frost, and nips his bud. I ventured like little wanton boys upon a sea of glory in bladders but far beyond my depth, lost now beneath a rude stream which must forever hide me. I'm forgetting the lines here, sorry about that. Oh, how wretched is the man that hangeth upon a prince's favor. That, at least, is how the soliloquy ends. I remember that.
Thank you.
But anyway, that's Cardinal Wolsey from Henry VIII, and that's one of my favorites.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Joseph.
Thank you.
Are we done?
We are done.
Okay, folks. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you all. I've enjoyed it.
Joseph.
All right. God bless everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.